Middle-earth Shadow of War as the New Shadow. The video game Middle-earth Shadow of War takes place in an alternate story world that depicts events preceding The Lord of the Rings, and yet it does testimony to the very danger Tolkien had envisioned for a sequel to The Lord of the Rings when he said, "It is inevitable that we should be concerned with the most regrettable feature of man's nature, their quick satiety with good." The game's prequel, Shadow of Mordor, tells the story of Talion, a non-canonical ranger who is sacrificed by Sauron's black captains in order to summon the wraith of Celebrimbor. The sacrifice backfires and Celebrimbor's wraith merges with Talion, reviving Talion, and the two set out to save Middle-earth. Celebrimbor/Talion uses his powers to start a civil war among the orcs in an attempt to overthrow Sauron. In Shadow of War, it becomes clear that Celebrimbor's priority is to amass power rather than save lives, which is what Talion struggles to do. Talion and Celebrimbor begin the second game on Mount Doom, where they have forged a new ring to challenge the One Ring. The games explore the idea of fighting Sauron from within Mordor, using his means, his creatures, and his weapons. This involves enslaving the orcs by magic, encouraging their worst impulses of warfare, competition, and cutthroat violence, which Talion and Celebrimbor subvert to their own ends. The games focus heavily on the anti-villain trope where the protagonist embodies virtuous, heroic traits and goals, but his means at attaining them are morally ambiguous. We know that Tolkien abandoned the New Shadow because it had the potential of repeating that which The Lord of the Rings had already exhaustively illustrated in terms of plot discovery and overthrow. Yet beyond structure, there lies also another reason as to why he abandoned it. When Tolkien says his sequel proved both sinister and depressing, this is not only limited to the genre or theme of the story, but also in terms of morality. He mentions satanistic religion and dark cults. Peace, justice, and prosperity have become boring to the good people of Gondor. The few pages Tolkien did compose of the New Shadow already set this sinister atmosphere. The story begins as a dialogue between an old man, Borlas, contemplating the nature of evil, and a younger man called Sauron, who questions and counters his beliefs. The text is reminiscent of such philosophical conversations as the father-son dialogue between Elendil and Herendil in The Lost Road. In both cases, Tolkien stages generational discrepancies when it comes to profound topics such as what is right, what is wrong, the past, and the current socio-political situation. Also, both dialogues contain a foreshadowing of some greater evil yet to come. However, the conversation between Borlas and Sauron does not finish off on a reconciliating note. From the beginning, Sauron is a sinister character who seems to have ulterior motives. The New Shadow, Tolkien's theme of the inevitable perpetuation of evil, gradually emerges through Sauron's arguments. He has a deep resentment towards Borlas. He accuses people of being hypocrites, and he talks of conspiracy. What's more, the name Sauron has an uncanny resemblance to Sauron, or even Satan, given Sauron's inquisitive role as one who tempts and tests. This is not to say that he is Sauron in a new form, but rather that, quote, the roots of evil, unquote, are deeply embedded in the story world. But there is an element of mystery and the supernatural about him nonetheless when he says, "I have eyes and ears and other senses, master." Sauron and his generation are bored with the idyllic state of their society. The restlessness is revealed through subtle remarks in a very shadowy way. In these early stages, the shadow gradually crystallizes through Sauron's arguments and also in Borlas's worry and in the change of weather in the story. Sauron and Berelac, who is Borlas's son, are both members of a younger generation, which seems to be heedless of past events, and Borlas, being an old man, is set in contrast to them. Tolkien illustrates how the new shadow arises within the new generation, and those who, quote, remembered the evil of old, unquote, are seen as a threat. The New Shadow opens a window into the problem concerning the fallible nature of humanity. No matter how blissful a state they find themselves in, there is always that Melkor ingredient that resurfaces sooner or later. Ceylon's serpentine arguments and discourse are the very shadow itself in rhetorical form, even in the heart of Borlas's own Eden-like garden where the conversation takes place. The shadow may be new due to time, space, and context, but it is the shadow, or rather the shadow nonetheless. Now, to illustrate the main problematic in Shadow of War, I use René Girard's anthropological concept of mimetic rivalry. This is a paradox when antagonists confront each other so strongly that they begin to resemble one another more and more. The initial differences that separated them are now dissolved. One's model becomes an enemy, or vice versa, which is the case in the game here, one's enemy becomes a model. Rivalries can be political, economic, athletic, sexual, artistic, intellectual, religious, and so on. Girard uses the word scandal to summarize the consequences of this problem. One party is always scandalized by the other because it sees this other as an obstacle. When rivals prevent each other from appropriating the same object of desire, they actually reinforce their double desire, to want what the other wants and to be the other. And the object of desire isn't necessarily even always the same thing. Celebrimbor desires peace for Middle-earth, while Sauron desires dominion. But the game shows very cleverly that there is a very thin line, or perhaps none at all, between peace and dominion. When one scandal occurs, it gives rise to another, resulting in many crises which proliferate and become all the more violent. This is known as violent contagion. At first, the contagion divides, fragments, and decomposes communities, and then later it gathers all those who have been scandalized to act against one single victim who is the scapegoat. As rivals multiply, they create a war of all against all. This war would annihilate the entire community unless its violence is transformed into a war against one, which should then re-establish unity once that scapegoat is eliminated. So ironically, violence has to intensify in order to produce its own antidote. The antagonistic dualism between Celebrimbor and Sauron in Shadow of War highlights this mimetic contagion. The two characters begin as enemies, but the more violent their enmity, and this is not only physical violence, the more they lack difference, and the more Celebrimbor turns into an antagonist himself. By forging a new ring to help him take over Middle-earth, Celebrimbor imitates his enemy through this very act of creation. We can view Sauron's ring, the One Ring, as the prototypical scandal. It can have a positive polarizing effect by distinguishing those who bow to its power, so those who accept the ring, from those who do not. This is related to Tolkien's statement that there is no inherent dualism in his legendarium. The good versus evil is always, quote, an unconscious reaction, a conscious reaction, unquote, which comes about, in this case, it comes about of the scandal. Yet the ring can have a negative effect too. It turns individuals against one another, obviously. They enter into mutual conflict and sometimes even self-conflict, when we think of Gollum. This is where the contagion mechanism is triggered. The ring attracts all kinds of individuals, even ones completely indifferent to each other. Its hostility becomes so contagious that it spreads to the most diverse individuals. In a paradoxical way, the contagion divides and fragments, but also gathers and reunites, which is exactly the nature of the One Ring when we think about it. The contagion lies in Celebrimbor's very act of having created another scandal to counter the original scandal, so the new ring versus the One Ring. Of course, Celebrimbor had created rings of power before, but they were never seen, they were never really as a means to an end, they were more art for art's sake. The idea of this new ring being diabolical may be implied in the game. For example, we can mind control enemies, but it's never explicitly condemned as such. The problem with the adjective new is that it is just not that. It is in fact the same old diabolical power that is at work. Borlas in the story was able to recognize this when he smelt the old evil and knew it for what it was. Once the new ring is forged, it becomes an essential feature for the gameplay itself. the player is able to use the ring to dominate enemies, which is what we can see down here in the corner. Talion and Celebrimbor subvert orcs, trolls, caragors, and even drakes to fight on his side by dominating their wills, which is a literal portrayal of the domination power that's ascribed to the ring in the books. Celebrimbor's silver ring emits a bluish light, which is opposed to the golden one ring that emits a fiery red color. The aesthetic of the new ring is reflected in Celebrimbor's new title as Bright Lord, which he gives himself. With this new title, he gains a new identity, but not in the positive sense which Tolkien calls ennoblement. In the game, it is rather a degradation that further cements Celebrimbor in Mimetic Rivalry. He becomes a new Sauron, which in turn does nothing to weaken the original Sauron. Rather, it amplifies Sauron's diabolical presence throughout this act of mimesis, or through this act. Ironically, though, the more confident and independent Celebrimbor becomes, the more this is a reflection of the illusions projected by his admiration for them. He becomes all the more enslaved to Sauron. In Unfinished Tales, it is mentioned that although Celebrimbor was not corrupted in heart or faith, he accepted Sauron as what he posed to be. It is Celebrimbor's love for craft that attracts him to Sauron in the first place. In fact, Sauron hardly needs to exercise any manipulation at all. He rather functions as a mirror in which Celebrimbor sees what he loves. So the Dark Lord does not actually use one's weaknesses against one. These are already his in a way, but rather one's strengths. And just to show you how diabolical Celebrimbor can sound, I'm going to play this clip here.
This fortress is once again under my command. An attempted rebellion has been put down. Its conspirators have been put to the sword. Its leader will soon suffer the same fate. You now hold this fortress for the Bright Lord! Here, my enemies will find no weakness, no mercy, only the unassailable strength of my army!
Yep, very diabolical indeed. Okay, so what role does the game's protagonist, Talion, fulfill in this struggle to restore order? Is there an end to all this violence? Well, J.R.R. introduces the concept of the single victim mechanism. The ultimate goal of sacrificing or expelling a victim is to regain some form of relief from the stress of conflict and violence within a community or group. That is why the biblical ritual of scapegoating involves transferring the sins of a male goat, the sins of a people onto a male goat and driving him into the wilderness. Talion, the male human being here, is caught in the violence between Elf and Maya. His story begins with loss. In the first game, he is tragically forced to witness the death of his family. The Black Hand of Sauron performs a real ritualistic sacrifice by killing Talion's family and Talion himself. In Shadow of War, there is a continuation of this collective violence against poor Talion. When Talion realizes Celebrimbor had only used him, his role as his ring bearer and vessel are taken over by Eltariel. She is an elf assassin sent by Galadriel who helps us throughout the game. Having no ring of power to sustain his life, Talion is left to die. So there is a collective violence of the two elves against the man Talion, who is the single victim. He is once again sacrificed for a greater cause, and yet unlike the first time, it's not through a ritual, but rather betrayal. However, Talion's sacrifice is not finalized until the very end of the game. When Celebrimbor and Eltariel leave him to die, he takes one of the Nazgul rings and is able to survive. Eventually, he gives in to this ring's power and becomes himself one of the 9. It is in this ultimate conversion that Talion is victimized. He goes from being the main protagonist in the game to a major antagonist in the books. He has been sacrificed by both Sauron and the elves. Although he chooses a so-called third way by submitting neither to Sauron nor to Celebrimbor, I don't think the game portrays Talion's decision as a solution to contagious violence. So why should he turn into a Nazgul in the end? Is this a realistic consequence of having been under the influence of a ring of power for so long? Does it provide a heartfelt background story to one of Tolkien's Nazgul? I believe the answers are all affirmative, and there is nothing wrong with that per se. The problem is the game does not allow Talion to break through the violence. By taking one of the 9 rings to sustain his life so that he could continue defending Minas Ithil and the people of Gondor, which is of course a selfless and very virtuous act, one begs the question whether he is really sacrificing himself, or rather being seduced by the possibility that a Sauronic ring offers. To have really made a sacrifice, Talion would not have taken up the ring and instead died an honorable death, not one as a ring wraith. But that would have been a whole different story and game altogether. One version of the game's ending does depict Talion as redeemed, yet this redemption lacks the inevitable sacrifice that Tolkien makes his characters undergo. In The Lord of the Rings, there is also no one hero who destroys the ring and saves Middle-earth. The ring's undoing comes about through sacrifice. Without this factor, the third way is nothing but Sauron's way once again. It's just a new way, much like the New Shadow. A final aspect worth considering is the war itself. So the game hinges on this idea that it is necessary to keep a mortal in a constant state of war. The notion of perpetual war harks back to Thomas Hobbes' political theory in Leviathan from 1651, where Hobbes rebukes the idea that humans are naturally social creatures and says that without a common power to keep them in awe, men are in a state of war. It is a time of crisis, permanent fear, and mistrust, where rules have broken down and there is no governing authority to keep people in check. This is very apparent when it comes to the orcs in the game and the use of the nemesis system, which is essentially the rotation of rivals that players fight and defeat throughout the game. There is a military and social hierarchy among the orcs where they can rise in rank or be demoted. The player is tasked with killing or recruiting orcs. There is envy, treachery, distrust among all the orcs. Talion's aim is to keep all of Mordor in a state of perpetual war so that no one party has the upper hand, and a total war against the rest of Middle-earth can be avoided. Some orcs go even so far as to challenge Sauron himself. For example, Zog the Eternal. He is a necromancer of the mystic tribe of the orcs who wants to resurrect a Balrog and use him against Sauron. I see this practice of dark arts as clearly it's the game's portrayal of Tolkien's idea of orc cults that arise in Middle-earth. The game emphasizes the role of orcs both on the geopolitical scale and on a more personal level. The insight into their lives, personalities, and their dynamic relationships certainly makes the games all the more interesting. It is also a response to the criticism that Tolkien portrayed orcs as base, passive, this demonized other. The games lend the orcs their own stories, emotion, and agency. I do see a latent danger in such a representation, however, because it downplays the real threat that Tolkien's idea of evil poses. And it allows the player to find it interesting and at some point even sympathize with this evil and violence. This is not to say that orcs must be automatically viewed and treated by us in an orcish manner, but it also does not imply that orcishness should be deconstructed or endorsed entirely. This is exactly the danger Tolkien envisions in the New Shadow when Gondorian boys start playing at being orcs and going around doing damage. The more one is exposed to or immerses themselves in that evil, the likelier he is to accept it. Humans begin to lose their humanity and in imitating orcs gradually become them. Further enmity is pitted between elves and men. Talion and Celebrimbor's initial friendship represents the bond between the two races. In Shadow of War, this bond is fractured. In the end, even Eltariel forsakes Talion. Interestingly, unlike Galadriel, who functions as a redeemer for herself and for her people, Eltariel's character sees the New Ring as a means to an end, so her character development goes in the opposite direction. Basically, Shadow of War vilifies elves and turns them against men. You certainly have this enmity in the books too at sometimes, but in the books it's always caused by the shadow, so it's either Sauron or Melkor who's behind it. Here in the game, it's not the result of being manipulated by a third party, but rather springs from the narrative itself or from the protagonists themselves. All in all, Shadow of War encapsulates that flawed nature of humans and the inversion of good and evil, which Tolkien had set for a sequel. The sequel shows how versatile the shadow can be, and that to take shape or regenerate, it does not need to do so physically at first. In the game, the protagonists eventually all become bad or they die, and major antagonists such as Shelob are portrayed as good. Although the game does not endorse but rather exposes these problems, it does not offer, morally speaking, a better alternative. So the game's solution to violence and war is to keep good and evil in balance, and I do not see this as a palpable solution. Thank you very much for your attention.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Jelena, for quite a fascinating, very different kind of talk as well from a game that's recently come out. What I found quite interesting around that was not only the mimesis element, but specifically that idea of kind of when you're talking about Talion and that idea of kind of ambiguity around, is it a choice, is it the seduction, and it kind of links back to some discussions that people have had about around the One Ring itself. So thank you very much. Now, we do have some questions as well. So, first question. If a new shadow or Melkor's part of the Song of the Ainur raises again in the Fourth Age, should we expect the Valar to send agents to Middle-earth to counter it?
To counter what exactly? Sorry, I didn't hear the first part of the question.
Sorry, I think there might be a little bit of glitching going on. There was one or two moments, I think, when we couldn't hear you for a couple of seconds in your paper as well. I'll read the question again. If a new shadow or Melkor's part of the Song of the Ainur rises again in the Fourth Age, should we expect the Valar to send agents to Middle-earth to counter it?
I mean, that's very speculative. You know, I could say that I feel that the Ainur could send some at that point in the fourth happened in the previous ages. So if this new age or time would be some kind of final kind of last stage or some kind of climax, then yeah, I would expect the Ainur and all these other powers then to pitch in. It's all or nothing then, yeah.
Yeah, good, thank you. And then we have another question asking, what do you think about Celebrimbor's portrayal in the games? How do you think it compares to his portrayal in the books?
It's very different to what we have in the books. First of all, it's much more expanded in the game. So we have his whole history with Sauron, and even Celebrimbor's family in the game is sacrificed, and we see all the pain that he goes through. And the games kind of justified that, all that pain then as the reason to why he kind of went crazy, you could say, like a megalomaniac. He wanted at first to have his revenge, to overthrow Sauron, to kind of defeat him. But as he progressed, then he just wanted to be more and more like Sauron, even though he was not aware of it. So he was convinced that he's doing something good, but that's that act of imitating your enemy even when you're not aware of it. So it's very interesting. I love the games. They're excellent, and I would play them over and over again. I find that it's really good that they kind of throw this danger in your face of what happens to Celebrimbor. But yeah, very different to the Celebrimbor in the books, much more expanded. And I guess the game kind of plays with these possibilities, even though the best of us with good intentions will eventually turn into a Sauron, perhaps.
Yeah, that idea of imitation, and then you become that as well. Brilliant, thank you. And our next question is saying, Jelena, thank you for your paper. In playing the game, I found Shelob as manipulator for her perhaps to be the new Melkor as instigator to encourage Talion toward the new evil, perhaps so she could control him and ultimately Middle-earth. Is this perhaps something that you found as well?
I think, yeah, it was a little bit strange with Shelob. Of course, in the books, we know her to be this kind of epitome of evil, this great monster or the unknown something. And in the games, I didn't talk much about her in my presentation, but in the games, she's kind of ambiguous. We're not sure if she's really helping us or not. But in the end, it turns out that even after Sauron had betrayed her, they were also in some kind of relationship. It turns out that she just wanted, to get back at Sauron, or to say that, you know, I care for Middle-earth. She cares for like the kind of like the mother of nature kind of way, that she just wants Middle-earth to be okay. It does not matter where she really stands in that. And she had foreseen Celebrimbor's fall and Talion's fall as well. So she asks him, how much are you willing to sacrifice? I think she is portrayed as a good character ultimately in the games. And that's that one thing that I find problematic, that inversion. It can be interesting, but I think it can be dangerous to see evil as good. And yeah.
Excellent, thank you. And we do have a few more questions as well that there's one here about the game's philosophy and Tolkien's, does the game's philosophy mirror Tolkien's philosophy? That in itself, you know, I can imagine that being a paper in itself. It's such a deep question. So we're going to move on to the next paper. I would like to thank you very much, Jelena, for coming and speaking to us today. It's been really fascinating, some great insights to some new ways that people have seen Tolkien in the 21st century. So thank you very much.